The asthma attack started without warning. David Mitchell was reaching for his coffee when the woman in seat 12B began wheezing violently, her face turning blue as she clawed at her throat. He immediately helped her upright, speaking in calm tones while his 7-year-old daughter Emma offered tissues. "Breathe with me," David coached gently, until the woman's airways opened and color returned to her cheeks. As she recovered, the woman stared at Emma with an expression David had never seen before. Pure recognition mixed with something that looked like terror. She fumbled in her purse and pulled out a small velvet pouch, her fingers shaking as she opened it. Inside was half of a heart-shaped locket, old and tarnished. "The other half," she whispered, her eyes never leaving Emma's face. "Is it still under her pillow?" David felt the air leave his lungs, because Emma had indeed slept with half a heart locket every night since she was 3 years old. He'd found it in her baby things, but never knew where it came from. The woman's next words changed everything. "I've been looking for you both for so long." David had been making this journey with Emma for 3 years now, ever since her first major surgery to repair a congenital heart defect that had been discovered during one of her early checkups. The condition had terrified David, bringing back memories of helplessly watching his wife Sarah battle cancer. But Emma had faced it all with the quiet courage that seemed to define her young life. She was a miracle child in more ways than one, having literally appeared on his doorstep 7 years ago during the worst thunderstorm Denver had seen in decades. The memory of that night was seared into David's consciousness like a brand, every detail as vivid as if it had happened yesterday instead of nearly a decade ago. He had been a widower for only 8 months when he found the cardboard box on his front steps, rain-soaked and trembling in the wind. Inside, wrapped in a pink hospital blanket that smelled of antiseptic and hope, was a newborn baby, with eyes like storm clouds and skin so translucent he could see the delicate network of veins beneath. Tucked beside the infant was a hastily written note that simply read, "Please love her," in handwriting that shook with either cold or desperation, and a delicate silver butterfly necklace that seemed impossibly small and precious. The 6 months that followed were a blur of social workers, court hearings, and sleepless nights, as David fought for the right to keep the child who had been abandoned at his door. The system seemed convinced that a 28-year-old single man couldn't possibly provide adequate care for an infant, especially one who might require ongoing medical attention. David had spent every penny of his savings on legal fees, had turned his entire life upside down to prove his worthiness as a father, had learned to change diapers and mix formula, and recognize the difference between a hungry cry and a scared one. But he had also learned stubbornness from grief, and he refused to let Emma disappear into foster care when she had already lost so much before she was even old enough to understand what loss meant. Now, watching Emma chatter quietly with the mysterious woman beside them, David felt that familiar surge of protective love that had defined his entire adult life since that stormy night. Emma had grown into a bright, curious child who saw the world as an endless source of wonder, despite the medical challenges she'd faced and the questions about her origins that remained unanswered. Her resilience amazed him daily, but it also made him hyper-aware of anything that might threaten the careful stability they'd built together over 7 years of bedtime stories, scraped knees, and quiet moments in hospital waiting rooms. The woman introduced herself as Hannah, explaining she was returning to Boston after a business trip, but there was something in her carefully measured responses that suggested she was holding back far more than she was sharing. Her hands shook almost imperceptibly as she spoke, and David noticed how she kept glancing at Emma when she thought no one was looking, her expression cycling through emotions too complex and raw for a chance encounter with strangers. As the plane reached cruising altitude, David noticed Hannah's breathing becoming increasingly shallow and labored, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrest between their seats with desperate intensity. "Are you feeling all right?" David asked, his voice taking on the calm, steady tone he'd perfected during Sarah's illness and Emma's medical emergencies. Hannah shook her head, her face growing pale as she struggled to catch her breath, beads of perspiration forming along her hairline despite the airplane's cool temperature. "Asthma attack?" she managed between gasps, her words coming in short, panicked bursts. I forgot my rescue inhaler in my checked luggage. This happens when I get emotional, when something triggers memories I thought I'd buried. The admission seemed to slip out before she could stop it, and David saw her eyes widen, as if she'd revealed more than she intended. Emma, without being asked, immediately reached into her small backpack and pulled out a packet of tissues, offering them to Hannah with the same gentle concern she showed injured animals at the park. "Here you go," Emma said softly, her voice carrying the natural empathy that never failed to amaze David. "Daddy always says breathing is the most important thing, and sometimes when people can't breathe, it's because their hearts are trying to tell them something important." The wisdom in such a young voice seemed to hit Hannah like a physical blow, and fresh tears mixed with her struggle for air. David flagged down a flight attendant while helping Hannah adjust her position, elevating her shoulders, the way he'd learned during his wife's difficult nights, when cancer had made every breath a battle worth fighting. The emergency inhaler arrived quickly, and as Hannah's breathing slowly returned to normal, David noticed how intently she watched Emma's every movement, as if trying to memorize the way she tilted her head when concentrating, or the particular rhythm of her quiet humming when she was content. There was something almost desperate in Hannah's attention, a hunger that spoke of long absence rather than casual interest, of someone who had been starving for exactly this kind of moment. "You're very kind," Hannah told Emma once she could speak normally again, her voice thick with emotion that seemed disproportionate to a simple gesture from a stranger's child. "Your daddy has raised you to be incredibly thoughtful. He must love you very much." Emma beamed at the compliment, immediately launching into an enthusiastic description of their upcoming doctor visit and how David always bought her ice cream afterward if she was brave during her examination. She talked about her favorite flavors and how she always got extra sprinkles because the ice cream man said brave girls deserved extra special treats. Hannah hung on every word as if it were precious, occasionally asking gentle questions that encouraged Emma to share more stories about her daily life, her friends at school, her favorite books, and her dreams of becoming either a veterinarian or a butterfly scientist when she grew up. Each detail seemed to both delight and wound Hannah in equal measure, as if she were experiencing joy and heartbreak simultaneously. David found himself relaxing slightly as he watched the easy rapport developing between them, though he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something significant he was missing, some connection that existed beneath the surface of their conversation. Emma had always been social, but there was something particularly natural about her interaction with Hannah, as if they'd known each other much longer than the 2 hours they'd been seated together. Hannah, for her part, seemed to shed some of her careful composure as she engaged with Emma, laughing genuinely at the child's amusing observations about airplane food and offering her own stories about traveling for work. But David noticed that whenever Emma mentioned her past or asked Hannah about her own family, the woman's responses became vague and carefully non-committal, her eyes taking on a distant quality that suggested painful memories lurking just beneath the surface. "Do you have children?" Emma asked with the innocent directness that only children possess, and David saw something flicker across Hannah's face, a flash of pain so quick and devastating he almost missed it. The question hung in the recycled air between them for a moment that stretched like eternity, and when Hannah finally answered, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Not exactly," she said carefully, her hand unconsciously moving to touch her butterfly necklace with fingers that trembled almost imperceptibly. "But I think about children a lot. I wonder what kind of person I might have been as a mother, what kind of stories I would have told, what kind of memories I would have wanted to create." The wistfulness in her voice made David look at her more closely, noticing for the first time the way she held herself, as if carrying some invisible weight that had settled deep in her bones and refused to be dislodged. There were shadows under her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and questions that had no comfortable answers, and when she thought no one was looking, her expression carried a loneliness so profound it made David's chest ache in recognition. As their flight began its descent into Boston, Hannah seemed to gather herself, sitting straighter and smoothing her dark hair with hands that trembled despite her obvious efforts to control them. Emma had dozed off against David's shoulder, her butterfly necklace catching the afternoon sunlight that streamed through the window, creating tiny rainbows that danced across the seat in front of them like promises of magic and possibility. Hannah's eyes were fixed on that necklace with an intensity that made David increasingly uncomfortable, her own hand repeatedly touching the identical pendant at her throat, in what appeared to be an unconscious gesture born of habit and memory. "That's a very unusual piece of jewelry," Hannah said quietly, her voice carefully controlled but underlaid with something that sounded almost like desperation. "The craftsmanship is exquisite. Where did you find something so unique?" David felt his protective instincts sharpen at the question, a warning bell sounding in the back of his mind. Very few people knew the details of Emma's arrival in his life, and he was always cautious about sharing too much information with strangers, no matter how well-intentioned they seemed. "It belonged to her birth mother," he said carefully, watching Hannah's face for any reaction. "It was left with her when she was placed for adoption." Hannah's face went completely white, all the blood draining from her features as if someone had pulled a plug somewhere vital. Her breathing became rapid and shallow again, but this time it wasn't asthma causing her distress. Her hands began to shake so violently that she had to clasp them together in her lap to keep them still, and when she spoke, her voice was barely audible above the airplane's engines. "The night of the storm," she whispered, and David felt the world tilt around him. 7 years ago. September 15th. Was it thundering when you found her? Was the rain coming down so hard you could barely see your own front door? The specific date and details hit David like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his vision narrow to a single point of impossible recognition. He had never mentioned the storm to anyone on this flight, had never shared the details of that night with a stranger. Very few people knew exactly when Emma had come into his life, and certainly no one knew about the weather conditions or the specific circumstances of her arrival. "How could you possibly know about that?" he asked, his voice sharp with sudden suspicion and growing alarm, his arms instinctively tightening around the sleeping child in his lap. Hannah's composure finally cracked completely, tears spilling down her cheeks, in streams that seemed to carry 7 years' worth of suppressed grief and hope and terror. "Because I'm the one who left her there," she whispered, the words tumbling out in a rush that seemed to have been building for nearly a decade. "I'm the one who wrapped her in that pink blanket and wrote that note with hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and put the necklace around her tiny neck before placing her on your doorstep and walking away in the rain, knowing I might never see her again." David felt the world tilt around him, the familiar airplane cabin suddenly feeling foreign and surreal, as if he'd stepped into someone else's life, or woken up in the middle of a dream that made no sense. Emma stirred against his chest, mumbling something in her sleep about butterflies and ice cream, and the sound of her voice seemed to anchor him to reality, even as everything else shifted like sand beneath his feet. "I was 19 and completely alone," Hannah continued in that same urgent whisper, the words pouring out of her like water through a broken dam. "My family had disowned me when they found out I was pregnant. They said I was a disappointment, a stain on their reputation, and they wanted nothing to do with me or the baby I was carrying. I'd been living in shelters for months, moving from place to place, sleeping in my car when the shelters were full, eating once a day when I was lucky. But when she was born, when I held her for the first time and saw those perfect storm gray eyes, I knew I couldn't give her the life she deserved." Hannah reached into her purse with shaking hands and pulled out a faded Polaroid photograph, its edges worn soft from years of handling and stained with what might have been tears, or time, or both. In the image, a much younger version of Hannah sat in a hospital bed, holding a newborn baby with storm-gray eyes that were unmistakably Emma's. Around her neck was the same butterfly necklace she wore now, and around the baby's neck was its smaller twin, the two pieces clearly designed as a matching set. "I bought these necklaces the day before she was born," Hannah said, her voice breaking with each word. "I found them in a little antique shop near the hospital, and something about them called to me. Butterflies are symbols of transformation, of beauty that emerges from struggle, of creatures that seem fragile but are actually strong enough to travel thousands of miles to find their home. I thought maybe, if she wore one and I kept the other, we'd always be connected somehow, even if we were apart." She handed David a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and soft from repeated handling. He recognized his own address, written in the same shaky handwriting as the note that had come with Emma 7 years ago. Below the address was a phone number, and the words, "In case of emergency," written in different ink, as if added later during a moment of desperate hope or regret. "I spent 3 weeks watching your house," Hannah continued, her tears falling freely now. "Learning your routines, seeing how you lived, trying to understand what kind of man you were. I saw the way you grieved for your wife, the way you tended her garden every evening like it was a sacred ritual. I saw you leave flowers on her grave every Sunday, and I watched you sit there for hours like you were having conversations with someone who couldn't answer back, but who you still needed to talk to." David's throat felt raw, his heart pounding so hard he was sure Hannah could hear it. The idea that someone had been watching him during those early months of grief, documenting his most private moments of pain and healing, should have felt like a violation. Instead, he found himself oddly grateful that Emma's birth mother had cared enough to make sure he was worthy of the gift she was planning to give him. "I thought maybe, just maybe, you might have enough love left for one more person who needed a home," Hannah whispered. "I saw the way you talked to the neighbors' children, how patient you were when they asked you questions about your garden or wanted to help you plant flowers. I saw kindness in you, and gentleness. And I thought that if I had to give her up, at least I could try to give her to someone who might love her the way I wished I could." The confession hung between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross, while Emma slept peacefully against David's chest, unaware that her entire world was shifting around her. David stared at Hannah, his mind struggling to process the magnitude of what she'd just revealed, while his arms instinctively tightened around the child who had become his entire universe. 7 years of bedtime stories and scraped knees and first days of school flashed through his mind, all the moments that had built the foundation of their life together. And now suddenly he was being asked to expand that foundation to include the woman who had made it all possible. "I never stopped thinking about her," Hannah said, her voice growing stronger, as if the act of confession had released something that had been locked inside her for too long. "Never stopped wondering if I made the right choice, if she was happy, if she was healthy, if she ever asked questions about where she came from. 3 months ago, I finally got the courage to come back to Denver. I took a leave of absence from my job in graphic design and spent weeks just watching from a distance, trying to catch glimpses of the life I'd given her. I saw you at the park with her," she continued, her eyes lighting up with the memory. "Saw how she laughed when you pushed her on the swings, saw the way she held your hand when crossing the street, saw how she looked at you with such complete trust and adoration. I knew then that I'd given her to exactly the right person, that every difficult choice I'd made had led to this perfect outcome. But I also knew I couldn't walk away again, not without at least trying to be part of her life somehow." David felt a mixture of gratitude and terror unlike anything he'd ever experienced. This woman had given him the greatest gift of his life, but her sudden appearance also threatened the carefully constructed world he'd built around protecting Emma from uncertainty and loss. "Why now?" he asked quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "Why are you telling me this now, after all these years of staying away?" "Because I've been buying tickets on flights from Denver to Boston for 2 months, Hannah admitted, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "I knew about her medical appointments. Knew you made this trip regularly, and I hoped I might run into you during one of her checkups. I've taken 16 different flights, always hoping to see you in the airport or on the plane, always losing my nerve at the last minute, and telling myself I was being selfish, that I had no right to disrupt the life you'd built with her. Today was supposed to be my last attempt," she said, her voice breaking again. "I'd promised myself that if I didn't see you today, I'd give up and go back to my life and try to find peace with never knowing her. But then there you were, walking down the aisle with this beautiful little girl who has my eyes and my chin, and her father's gentle spirit, wearing the necklace I put around her neck when she was barely 6 hours old." Emma began to wake up as the plane's wheels touched the runway, stretching and yawning before looking up at David with sleepy eyes that were so much like Hannah's it took his breath away. "Are we here, Daddy?" she asked. And David felt the word daddy resonate differently than it ever had before, carrying new weight and meaning now that he understood the full magnitude of the trust that had been placed in him 7 years ago. Hannah watched the exchange with an expression of pure longing mixed with pride, as if she were simultaneously heartbroken and grateful for the bond she was witnessing. The other passengers began standing and gathering their belongings, but the three of them remained seated, caught in a moment too fragile and momentous to break without careful consideration of what came next. "Emma," David said gently, his voice carefully controlled, "this is Hannah. She's someone very special who knew your birth mother very well." He paused, looking at Hannah for guidance, unsure how to navigate this impossible situation without overwhelming his daughter or making promises he couldn't keep. "She has some stories about when you were a baby that she'd like to share with you." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the complete truth either. And David could see Hannah struggling with the same dilemma of how much to reveal and how quickly. Emma studied Hannah with the fearless curiosity that defined childhood, taking in her tear-stained face and the way she clutched the faded photograph like it was the most precious thing in the world. "Did she tell you stories about me when I was little?" Emma asked with innocent directness, and Hannah's voice broke as she answered. "She told me you were the most beautiful, perfect little girl in the whole world," Hannah said, her words careful and precise. "She said you had eyes like storm clouds and a heart stronger than anyone she'd ever met. She said you were going to grow up to do amazing things and make the world a better place just by being in it." Emma nodded solemnly, as if this information confirmed something she'd always suspected about herself. "Daddy says I'm strong too," she said proudly, unconsciously touching her butterfly necklace. "He says this necklace gives me extra brave powers, and that whoever gave it to me must have loved me very much." Hannah looked at David with eyes full of gratitude and something else he couldn't quite identify. Perhaps recognition of the father she'd always hoped he would become. The terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of travelers rushing toward their destinations, but David, Emma, and Hannah moved through it in a bubble of careful quiet, each step taking them further from the safety of anonymity and closer to an unknown future that would require courage from all of them. Emma had slipped her hand into Hannah's with the natural trust that had defined her approach to the world since birth, while Hannah looked down at the small fingers intertwined with hers, as if she couldn't quite believe they were real. David carried both their bags, his mind racing through 1,000 different scenarios and possible complications, while his heart pulled him toward a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. He thought about Emma's questions over the years about her birth parents, questions he'd answered as honestly as he could while protecting her from the pain of abandonment. Now, suddenly, he had the opportunity to give her something he'd never been able to provide on his own, a connection to where she came from, answers to questions she hadn't even learned to ask yet. They found a quiet corner in the coffee shop David had suggested, away from the main flow of foot traffic, where they could speak without being overheard. Emma immediately settled herself at the small table with her coloring book, while David and Hannah sat across from each other, the weight of 7 years' worth of unspoken questions hanging between them like a curtain that neither quite knew how to part. "I don't want to disrupt your life," Hannah said quietly, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup she hadn't touched, the heat warming her palms but doing nothing to calm the trembling that seemed to have settled into her bones. "I don't want to confuse her or make you feel like I'm trying to take her away from you or undo all the beautiful work you've done in raising her. I just needed to know that my choice was the right one. I needed to see that she was loved and happy and thriving." "She is," David said simply, watching Emma carefully color within the lines of a butterfly drawing that seemed almost prophetic now. "She's the center of my entire universe. Every decision I make, every plan I have for the future, it all revolves around making sure she has the best life possible. She's taught me more about love and courage and hope than I ever thought possible." Hannah's eyes filled with fresh tears, but they seemed to be tears of relief rather than sadness, as if a weight she'd been carrying for 7 years was finally beginning to lift. "I can see that," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "The way she looks at you, the way she says, 'Daddy,' with such complete security and trust, there's such peace in her. That's exactly what I wanted for her when I made the hardest decision of my life. I wanted her to have a father who would see her as a gift instead of a burden, who would celebrate her instead of resenting her. Emma looked up from her coloring to study both adults with the intuitive perception that children sometimes possess, her gray eyes moving between them as if she were solving a puzzle that adults had made unnecessarily complicated. "Are you sad?" she asked Hannah directly, her voice carrying the same gentle concern she showed to injured animals or crying friends. "You look like you're happy and sad at the same time. Like when I watch movies about puppies finding their families after being lost for a long time." Hannah laughed through her tears, a sound that was indeed both joyful and heartbroken, carrying notes of 7 years' worth of suppressed hope and grief. "That's exactly right," she told Emma with surprising honesty. "I'm sad because I missed watching you grow up and learn to walk and say your first words and all the wonderful things that make you who you are. But I'm happy because I can see what an amazing little girl you've become, and I know that you've been loved every single day of your life." Emma considered this explanation with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. Her brow furrowed in concentration as she processed the complex emotions that were clearly beyond her years, but somehow not beyond her understanding. Then she reached across the table and patted Hannah's hand with the same gentle gesture she used when David had difficult days, or when she sensed that someone needed comfort they couldn't ask for directly. "It's okay," she said with the simple certainty that only children possess, her voice carrying wisdom that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her 7 years of experience. "Daddy always says that sometimes the best things happen when we're not expecting them, and sometimes people come into our lives exactly when we need them most. Maybe you being here now is one of those best things, even if it feels sad and happy at the same time." The wisdom in her words stunned both adults into silence, highlighting the extraordinary child they both loved from different distances and in different ways. David felt his heart expand in a way he hadn't known was possible, watching his daughter offer comfort to the woman who had given her life with the same natural empathy she brought to every relationship in her young world. "What if," David found himself saying, the words emerging before he'd fully formed the thought, "what if you didn't have to disappear again?" Hannah's breath caught, and her coffee cup rattled against the saucer as her hands began to shake with a different kind of tremor, one born of hope rather than fear. "What do you mean?" she whispered, afraid to let herself believe that this conversation might lead somewhere other than another goodbye. David looked at Emma, who was watching them both with patient interest, and then back at Hannah, seeing in her face the same longing he'd felt during those early months when he'd worried that he wasn't enough to give Emma everything she needed. "I mean, what if we figured out a way for you to be part of her life? Not as someone trying to replace anyone or change the foundation we've built, but as someone who cares about her and wants to help her understand her story." The possibility hung in the air between them, fragile and precious and terrifying in its implications. Hannah covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs that seemed to carry 7 years' worth of suppressed hope and grief, and the desperate wish for a second chance she'd never dared to ask for. Emma quietly moved from her chair to stand beside Hannah, offering her another tissue with the same matter-of-fact kindness she showed to everyone who needed comfort. "You don't have to cry so much," Emma said gently, her small hand resting on Hannah's shoulder with surprising steadiness. "Daddy says crying is just how feelings clean themselves up, like when it rains and makes everything grow better afterward. Maybe, after you're done crying, we can figure out how to be friends." 6 months later, David opened his front door on a crisp Saturday morning to find Hannah standing on his porch, carrying a canvas bag filled with art supplies and wearing the slightly nervous smile that had become familiar during her weekly visits to Denver. Emma's delighted squeal echoed from the kitchen as she abandoned her breakfast pancakes and launched herself into Hannah's arms with the enthusiasm she reserved for favorite people who had earned their place in her carefully curated circle of trust. "Hannah, you brought the watercolors," she exclaimed, already eyeing the art supplies with the focused intensity of a true artist. "I finished the painting of the butterfly garden, and I want to show you how I mixed the colors to make the perfect shade of purple for the lupins." The easy familiarity in her voice spoke of months of careful relationship building, of trust earned through consistency and patience, and the gradual understanding that love could expand to include new people without diminishing what already existed. The arrangement they'd worked out wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, built on honesty and careful communication, and the shared understanding that Emma's well-being came before anyone's individual desires or needs. Hannah had requested a transfer to her company's Denver office, moving into a small apartment across town that allowed her to be part of Emma's life without overwhelming the delicate balance David had spent years creating. She attended school plays and birthday parties, helped with homework when David worked late, and slowly, carefully, built a relationship with the daughter she'd given up, but never stopped loving. Emma had accepted Hannah's presence with the same natural grace she'd shown that first day on the airplane, incorporating her into their family structure as if she'd always been meant to be there. She called Hannah by her first name, understanding instinctively that there was room in her life for both the father who had raised her and the birth mother who had chosen her family. That love was not a finite resource that had to be carefully rationed, but something that multiplied when shared freely. They spent the morning in Sarah's old garden, which had become a family project of sorts over the past months. Hannah had proven to have an intuitive understanding of growing things, and under her guidance the flower beds that David had maintained as a memorial had transformed into something living and growing and forward-looking. The space now held both the past and the present, Sarah's favorite roses blooming alongside new plantings that Hannah and Emma had chosen together, creating a harmony that honored what had been, while making room for what was becoming. Emma flitted between them like the butterfly on her necklace, helping plant new bulbs while chattering about her upcoming art show at school and whether Hannah thought butterflies really could see all the colors that flowers made specially for them. Her questions were endless and wonderful, covering everything from the science of pollination to the mythology of transformation, and both adults found themselves learning as much from her curiosity as they were teaching through their answers. "Will you come to my recital next week?" Emma asked Hannah as they worked together to stake a young tomato plant, soil dark under their fingernails and sunshine warming their backs. "I'm playing Butterfly Kisses on the piano, and Daddy says it's going to make everyone cry happy tears because that's what good music does." Hannah looked across the garden at David, who nodded his encouragement, still sometimes amazed by how natural these moments had become. These requests had become more frequent and more natural over the months, as Emma grew comfortable with the idea that having Hannah in her life didn't diminish her bond with David, but rather expanded the circle of people who loved her unconditionally. She was building a family that looked nothing like the traditional structures she saw in her friends' homes, but which felt exactly right for the particular combination of people who had found their way to each other through choice, rather than circumstance. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," Hannah promised, brushing dirt from Emma's hands with the tender care of someone who had waited 7 years for the privilege of such simple gestures. "But you'll have to save me a seat next to your daddy, because I think we both get a little emotional when it comes to watching you shine." Emma nodded seriously, already planning the logistics of making sure her two most important adults were properly positioned to witness her performance. That evening, after Hannah had driven back to her apartment and Emma was settled in bed with a new book about butterfly migration, David sat in his living room, looking through the photo albums that had multiplied exponentially over the past months. Pictures of Emma's first steps and first day of school now shared space with images of art projects completed with Hannah, family dinners that included 3 generations of butterfly necklace wearers, and quiet moments in the garden, where the past and present grew together in beautiful, unexpected harmony. His phone buzzed with a goodnight text from Hannah, a ritual that had developed naturally over time as their carefully constructed family had found its rhythm. "Thank you for letting me be part of her story," it read. "Thank you for being the father I always knew you'd be, even when I was too young and scared to tell you that myself." David typed back his own message of gratitude, words that had become easier to express as the months had taught them all how to navigate this new territory of shared love and mutual respect. Outside, a gentle rain had begun to fall, the kind of soft spring shower that made everything grow and reminded David of renewal and possibility. He thought about the night 7 years ago, when a different storm had brought Emma into his life, and about the chain of choices and chances and acts of faith that had led them to this moment. The sound of rain against his windows no longer carried the weight of memory and loss, but instead felt like a lullaby, promising new growth and continued stories yet to be written. Emma padded downstairs in her pajamas, the butterfly necklace glinting in the lamplight, unable to sleep because of her excitement about the recital, and her certainty that having both her daddy and Hannah in the audience would make her performance even more special. "Daddy," she said, climbing into his lap with the easy affection of a child who had never questioned her place in the world. "Do you think Hannah dreams about butterflies too?" David wrapped his arms around his daughter, breathing in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo and feeling the solid warmth of her against his chest. Through the window, he could see the garden where they'd all worked together that day, where Sarah's memory lived alongside new growth, where the past informed the present without imprisoning it. "I think," he said carefully, his voice full of the wonder that Emma brought to his life every day, "that Hannah dreams about a lot of things that are beautiful and free and exactly where they're supposed to be." Emma nodded against his shoulder, satisfied with this answer, and together they listened to the rain that promised new growth and continued stories. The butterfly necklaces they wore had become symbols of something larger than any of them had originally understood. Not just connection and memory, but the mysterious mathematics of love that multiplied rather than divided, creating ripples that extended far beyond what any of them could have imagined on that stormy night when a frightened teenager had made the hardest and most loving decision of her young life. And in the morning, when the sun rose on their carefully constructed, imperfectly perfect family, they would wake up knowing that love could take forms that defied conventional wisdom, that families could be built through choice as much as through biology, and that sometimes the most beautiful butterflies emerge from the most difficult transformations, strong enough to travel any distance to find their way home.